Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and a very warm welcome to Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week. My name is Andy Walker, and I'm delighted to be hosting these online sessions, which form the biggest green infrastructure conference and the UK's official National Awareness Week on the crucial issues around energy security, green infrastructure, net zero, and the environment. And also, crucially, what are we going to do to address and combat climate change? We're delighted to be back for year 2 of this week, and we have a packed agenda for you all. Over the next 3 days, we'll be hosting a blend of incisive interviews with leaders in climate action. We'll get to that in a moment. An insightful keynote conference agenda and a series of insider deep dive webinars organised by net zero policy movers and shakers. Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week brings together all the stakeholders needed to deliver the green infrastructure we require to reach net zero by 2050 and to ensure Britain's energy is both secure and, crucially, affordable. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the wide range of experts we have assembled before us, but we also want you, our audience, to play your part too. So if at any point you have any questions that you want to put to any of our panelists or my interviewees this morning, then please just post them in the chat box and I'll do my level best to put them to our speakers and panelists. Anyway, that's enough from me. It's time to get started with day 1 of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week. We're going to kick things off this morning with 3 climate leadership interviews where we'll be looking, not surprisingly, at the issue of leadership and why it's so important in the fight against climate change. Joining me over the next couple of hours, we have Xeon Lights, founder of Emergency Reactor, who's in the room with me now, Adrian Del Maestro, Global Energy Advisory Lead at AECOM, and also Tom Burke, co-founder and chair of the climate change think tank E3G. And I can't wait to hear what they've all got to say to us today. Our first interviewee this morning is Xeon Lights, who is, as I said, the founder of Emergency Reactor, which is a campaign and public information group around issues related to climate change. Xeon is an internationally sought after speaker on science communication and environmental activism, and she's got a long history of environmental and science writing, contributing for many national newspapers and magazines, and she's been involved in climate action for over a decade. Xeon also played a core role in Extinction Rebellion's UK media and messaging team, where she also founded the climate reporting newspaper The Hourglass and became a high-profile spokesperson for the climate group. I'm going to be talking to Xeon for around about 15 minutes, after which we will have time for questions from our audience. So as I said before, please post any questions that you've got in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them in the time that we have available. Xeon, good morning and welcome. You have a varied and interesting biography, I have to say, when I looked at it online and elsewhere. From your perspective, what is good leadership in this field, and why does it matter in the fight against climate change?
Good morning to you as well, Andy, and thank you for that great introduction. It's an interesting question because I don't think many people consider themselves to be leaders. You know, I wouldn't say that I put that in my bio ever, and yet I have been told by many different people that this is the case, and also that people have their own ideas of what a leader should be and should represent. Now, in the climate movement, in the environmental activist movement, this has always meant very specific things. It's kind of, you know, criticizing the system. How do you change the status quo? It often goes much broader than just environmental issues. And actually, the funny thing is, I was a member of these groups for quite a long time and very active on various different fronts, whether writing or out protesting or, you know, any number of things, giving interviews on television, talks, all kinds of stuff. But it was when I stepped out of the bubble of what was expected of me, the things I was expected to say, as a climate activist or environmental, someone who cared about the environment. It was only when I stepped out of those kind of constraints that people started saying, hey, this is a leader. And that's great from my perspective, because I think it shows, actually some of the things that I say that you don't hear anywhere else are actually really important, and it's really important that they're said. And I really encourage other people to question some of the old ideas that we have in the environmental movement, because some of them have not been helpful for us, and some of the messaging can really put people off as well, and some of the actions can put people off. And I think we need to think about those things in more depth and have conversations about it, because that's the only way that we can progress with any of this, is to have conversations, and especially with people who have different opinions to us. That essentially broadly is what climate leadership has come to mean to me, I think.
Interesting that you should say there that when you were in that bubble, that people maybe didn't see you as a leader. But isn't it the case that by virtue of the fact that you were taking action, isn't taking action an expression of leadership as well? Do you think?
Yeah, and I think people see it that way now because they look back on things. I mean, I have done a lot of in my younger years, I did a lot of different actions. But to me at the time, I was just a lemming. I was just doing what everybody else was doing. Let's go and try and shut that coal-fired power station. Let's go and fight tar sands. But now I would say, on reflection, we've been doing these things for decades. I'm not saying they've made zero difference, but there might be other ways to try and make a difference. For example, not just fighting against what we don't want, but fighting for what we want, and trying to envision the future that we want, rather than only relying on, negative or apocalyptic kind of future scenarios, which actually, if you look around at not just activists, but journalism as well, that is the dominant messaging. And I always kind of say to people now, how can we create that world that we want for our children if we never envision it or imagine what it could look like? We're always thinking about the worst case scenario. And that's really where I stepped out of the bubble, is saying maybe we shouldn't only be focusing on and shaping our ideas around what we're against. Maybe we should think about what we're for too.
So, what does that look like then in reality? I mean, are you saying there that it's something about having a more positive outlook? How can individuals make a difference in that kind of scenario, in your view?
Absolutely, it's about being optimistic. Now, this is a funny thing, because I think that people think that being pessimistic is clever, but actually being pessimistic is easy, and it's often not accurate. Being pessimistic often means you won't reach your goals. I think we have to be optimistic. We also have to look. We have to be able to hold different ideas in our heads, right? We have to be able to accept, yes, um, we have created environmental problems. We did burn a lot of fossil fuels. That is problematic. But equally, we know that there are alternatives now to those fossil fuels. We know that clean energy is being built en masse around the world, actually very rapidly. Yes, maybe a lot of people would say it's not quickly enough, or it's 20 years too late, but it is happening. It is rapid. And yeah, we burned the fossil fuels, but that was so that we could progress and develop and, escape poverty. Essentially, for most of human history, poverty was the norm for most people. We didn't deliberately, no one intentionally said, let's destroy the only planet we have to live on, let's make our air dirty. And actually, if you look historically at what we have achieved, let's do this for a minute, because it's something we never do in the environmental movement. Look at all the things we've achieved. We fixed the ozone layer, right? Lots of nations had to come together to make those decisions to ban CFCs so that the ozone layer would be protected. And then we were lucky in that after that happened, we found that actually it repaired itself too. um, we have improved efficiency of cars. Yes, okay, cars are polluting, but cars in the 1970s were far more polluting. There's a saying that a parked car in the 1970s was more polluting than a car now going at 100 miles per hour. And the reason for that is they were very inefficient, they were heavy, so they used a lot of um, oil. There are lots of different things that have improved because we have really good environmental standards, and we've done this in all areas across the board. And if you look globally, we've done so much to help lift people out of poverty, get them access to energy, and now to try and decarbonize as well. Actually, we're doing really well as a species. I know that's hard to imagine. I open the news like anyone else. I look at my social media and I just think I can't look at the news right now. And that's my negative bias. We all have this negativity bias, creeps in and kind of gives us this dark lens of the world. But actually, we have done so many extraordinary things, and none of those were by accident. They were all by deliberate actions, by individuals working together to say, how do we fix this problem? How do we bring down pollution? How do we now transition from diesel cars to electric vehicles? Because again, yes, it's not a final solution. A lot of environmentalists will say that, but it's an incremental solution. And we've only ever achieved things by incremental solutions. And if you look at our trajectory now, I think we're doing really well. And I'm very optimistic. That's not to say we should stop and no one should, that it will all be fine if we stop. But as far as I can see, most people are very intrinsically driven to make these changes and to drive this change in the world. And that to me is a very powerful force and something we should be proud of and should acknowledge.
I think it's. I think you're right to say that there has been some significant changes and progress made, but it's not me saying it. Some of the established organisations around the world, whether it be in the UK, the Climate Change Committee, the UN, other different bodies, the World Bank, a load of different organisations are concerned about the pace of change and whether or not we're going to meet, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Are we moving quick enough? And if we're not, how can we increase that pace of change while taking people with us?
So, are we moving quick enough? I mean, this is it's a tricky framing because we should have done all of this decades ago. We should have decarbonized decades ago. We should have reduced reliance on oil. We should have reduced fossil fuels. This cannot be as rapid a change as everybody wants it to be. If we look at what happened in the energy crisis, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we had an energy crisis. People can't afford to heat their homes. There are impacts on people. People will die if they don't have sufficient air conditioning in the summer in hotter countries. We can't just stop these things overnight. We can only make the incremental changes. Now, if you look at the International Energy Agency's latest report, they actually are very optimistic, saying that we are on track to keep below 1.5 warming. I actually wrote an article about this on my Substack because when I came across this report, I was so surprised because when it's the opposite message, when a year ago, they said we're not going to keep within 1.5 warming. That was all over the news everywhere. Now, the IEA has looked at the numbers. This isn't in opinion, this is data. They've looked at the numbers, how much clean energy is built, how much is fossil fuels being phased out, how much carbon reduction will there be, where does that leave us? And it is very promising. It is happening so rapidly. This shift is happening so rapidly, even if it's not as rapid as we want it to be, and even if it didn't happen as far back as we want it to happen, that it does look like we may be on track to stay below 1.5 warming. Now, I appreciate a lot of people don't want to shout about this and be excited about it because they might think, well, then the pressure will lessen. And that's what the activist groups are for. They're to keep the pressure on politicians, on policymakers. But at the same time, we also do need the cheerleaders and the people who say the data shows this is working. Let's keep doing it. Because otherwise you'll find people can just get very bogged down and even just give up. And I've seen this in young people, and it happened in Extinction Rebellion in our youth groups where they would just say, I just feel completely hopeless and what's the point? And we don't want that. It's got to be a careful balance, I think, of looking at the data, what's working, where are the pressure points that we can push, but also acknowledging that some things are going really well and that there is still a lot of hope out there.
I think that positive reinforcement is important in any area of life. I think it can't all be doom and gloom, even amongst the doom and gloom, because otherwise, you'd give up and pack up and go away. But I just want to sort of probe you a bit more about whether the politicians are doing enough, and also how this whole issue has become a political hot potato. Because in the UK, at least, we've got the King's Speech taking place. I think it's today, or is it tomorrow? I've lost track of the myriad of political developments that we've got here at the moment. However, suffice to say, we saw in the aftermath of the Uxbridge by-election, where ULEZ, for example, became a political hot potato. It seems that some of our politicians are looking to use climate change as a wedge issue, to basically, I suppose, divide people on one level. How do you view that, where basically politicians, if you like, are basically potentially backtracking on some of the things that they said they would do a while ago. Maybe that's a trait of all politicians, but anyway, I'd be interested in your view.
Well, I mean, first of all, I speak to a lot of different politicians, and I would say there are no broad strokes here. Some politicians are really, really in this. They're really worried. They have children that are worried about the future. They want to make all the changes possible. And then you have some that are using it as you say, wedge issue. Though I'd say climate change has always been a wedge issue right back from, you know, 20 years ago. There was a lot of denial around whether it was even human driven. There's broad consensus on that now generally, but now that attitude has shifted onto climate action. So it's now becoming more difficult for leaders to make decisions around, ULEZ, low traffic neighborhoods. We've had protests here around low traffic neighborhoods, which really surprised me. My little city of Exeter, a couple of roads where the air pollution's, dangerously high, kids living on that street. Residents said, let's close these two roads, let's do a trial and see if those come down. Typically the air pollution does come down if you close the roads temporarily. And there have been protests, people really angry, saying, why are you restricting my access? Well, you can still access the roads, you just have to go around. But I was surprised at the amount of anger or misinformation around that. And I think that is because it's being used by people to say this is about control or this is about, other negative things, whereas, which is a shame actually, because then I've spoken to some of those people in those groups and I've said, what about the air quality and what about these environmental issues? And they actually care about all of these issues. So I think we need politicians to be mindful of that and mindful that there will be resistance. There will be resistance to making these changes. That if you think about the smoking ban, right? I don't know if you remember the resistance to the idea of smoking indoors. Now the polls show that 99% of people would not go back to allowing people to smoke indoors, but at the time it was completely normal and people heavily protested it. And the same thing happened with carrier bags, the carrier bag ban, although it was
Well,
called that, but it wasn't a ban.
I'm glad you've mentioned both of those things because I used to work. I was head of campaigns for Keep Britain Tidy, and I remember sitting on the breakfast television couch with numerous people saying the bag charge is a crazy idea. You're going to hit working class people, blah blah blah. No one would go back to where we were before on that. While we're
No,
on these kind
and
of
we're very adaptable. We'll be fine. And if it turns out that it was a bad decision, it didn't work, we can go back. Nobody's going to be harmed by trialing some of these things, even if it's a trial that isn't successful. Though actually things like the low traffic neighborhoods have been successful around the world, which is why we're trying to implement them, because the alternative is what? The alternative is to say, get out of your car. Now, no one's going to do that, and I don't think we should do that. I don't think we should tell people, but there has to be some other way. This has been trialed. It works. It's a shame that people are now using that. I would say they're using it as a distraction. Let's make this into a culture war. I mean, this is happening with all kinds of issues. And I think that's a shame. I think it brings out the worst in humanity, actually. Like, there is so much we have to offer and so much we can do, and we will adapt to these things. And we should be, glad that we can both solve the issues and still maintain our lifestyles really in the same way. But there is a bit of noise around it at the moment. I think it will die down.
Yeah, I think both those issues you mentioned, I would argue that both of those needed leadership to put them onto the national agenda. As you said yourself, we wouldn't go back on either of those issues now. And the people who brought those to the fore were, basically ridiculed to begin with. And then obviously they become the new common sense. I suppose people do worry about, sort of the political kind of background and all the rest of it. Interesting question from Simon in the chat, and I must ask you this. He's looking ahead to the general election. No one knows when that's going to be, probably next year. Does Xeon see any difference between Labour and Conservative policy on large nuclear and SMRs going forward? Do you have a view on that?
Well, how political am I allowed to be? I would say that the current government has failed us on nuclear. We've had 13 years now. They keep saying it was the other party. In 13 years, you could have built, look at South Korea. They've built so much clean energy. They've built several nuclear power plants in just 4 to 5 years. Why is it taking us so long? I understand there are problems with planning regulation. I understand there are worker shortages, but all of these things are what the government is control of. And if we can't solve those, then we can't solve so many of our issues. We should be building all of this infrastructure. Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and now we can't build housing, we can't build clean energy. We can't build trains. I think it's time for a changing of the guard. Personally, I have looked closely at Labour's policies on this, and they are committed to building more nuclear power and also advanced technology, but there's no specific numbers. But saying that, the current government doesn't have specific numbers beyond Hinkley being finished and Sizewell C being built. There is no plan beyond that, and I've been pushing for this for some time. That because actually, what's going to happen is so much of our old nuclear capacity is shutting down because it's old, like Heysham and other sites. That all of that will go over to fossil fuels. So we're not even replacing the old capacity at the moment. Even once Hinkley and Sizewell are built, that'll just about cover it. We are not moving forward with this. Whereas, like I say, South Korea is doing it, India and China are doing it. There are so many countries just building clean energy very quickly. It provides good jobs for people. It ensures energy security. France has done it since the 1980s. This is something we really need to get a move on. And I have to say, I don't see it happening with the current government at the moment. Although I do know there are politicians in the party who are very keen, but unfortunately the policies just aren't coming forward. And it does need things like absolute planning reform as well for it to happen in this country. The red tape around building is phenomenal, and actually, ironically, a lot of that is because of our very strict environmental standards. That the standards are fine, but we've taken it too far with the planning regulations. So there needs to be some reform there as well.
I think on that, and I think leadership is multifaceted. It isn't just about getting things done. I think it's about preparing the ground to get things done as well. And I think politicians of all stripes, in my opinion, have actually failed. As someone who's written about infrastructure for nearly 30 years, the idea that we have some of the countries that you just mentioned are way ahead of the UK in terms of deliverance of deliverance. That's a bit of a funny word. Delivering infrastructure across the board should be a source of shame, really, for a country that was, as you correctly said, the birthplace of the industrial revolution. So I think it's right to say that politicians aren't doing enough, but there are politicians out there. Unfortunately, not enough of them in influence, as influential as they should be, who have a view on these issues. I just want to come back to you mentioned earlier about young people in particular being exercised by this issue, and that's something that definitely should concern our politicians. How do you think we can channel that interest, and and what can be done with that in terms of how we can progress these issues going forward?
I've written about this actually because I used to be one of those young people, and well, but when I was a teenager, which I definitely am not anymore, I had that kind of same what we call eco anxiety, but at the time it wasn't called that. I'd learned about global warming in science at school. I was really concerned. I didn't know why people around me weren't concerned. At least now there's kind of people feel a bit more that the issue is being talked about and something is being done. But equally, when I was in Extinction Rebellion, our youth group had serious levels of anxiety in those groups, and I would say just utter despair in some of these young people that they feel that they have no future. I mean, look, they've been in some cases leaders have told them. Greta Thunberg has got up on and said to UN events, hasn't she, that you've taken our future. So a lot of young people feel like that, and I think that's a shame because actually, if you're a young person in this country or virtually any country in the West, you are more powerful than most people in the world, right? You have access to things and a high quality of life and a strong voice, access to the internet, formal education. You have everything at your disposal to be able to try and make a difference here, where quite a lot of people around the world do not have that privilege. We are very, very wealthy, right? We are the wealthiest people in the world. If you have access to all of these things, water, heating, lighting, technology, education, healthcare, you are one of the wealthiest people in the world. So I think it's really a shame that these people are feeling the despair that actually there are lots of young people in other countries who have no voice, who do not have access to those things, and they will be hit hardest by climate change. Therefore, it is absolutely our duty to try to mitigate that, not despairing that our futures will be impacted. Everybody's future will be impacted. But this is there's a saying on this actually that we may all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I think that message is really important for young people that have been led to believe that they are powerless, because they are not. And if you look at someone like Greta Thunberg, she is not powerless. She has been incredible. She's had an incredible impact on the world. I just wish more young people would realize that and use their voice and influence in whatever way they can, instead of feeling that they should give up and that there's no point. And actually, anxiety can be used to channel that kind of action. But let's not only go and block roads. There's a lot more influential, powerful ways to use your voice than to just go into these groups where they kind of say this is the last option, is just to come and sit in the road. I don't agree with that. I think that there are many different avenues for many different kinds of voices, and we should encourage it.
One of the things that strikes me, working in the infrastructure and particularly the engineering sector, is the number of younger people who are working in that sector now who are absolutely down the line in a good way on net zero, on sustainability. And I think they would, they are keeping their organizations honest, if you like, in the way that they design buildings, in the way that we make places. And I think we'll hear more about that from Adrian Del Maestro at ACOM when I interview him at 10 o'clock, because I know that, those people are extremely engaged in what needs to be done, and they would say that they have a real opportunity to do it because they are designing the buildings and
Yeah, and
building the buildings
actually,
of the future.
Professor James Hansen, if people don't know who he was a very prominent climate scientist. He was the first climate scientist to testify to Congress to say climate change is being caused by people. We need to do something about this. Long legacy of both research and activism. And he has come out, he's in his 80s now. He's been doing this for a long time. He's written multiple books on these issues. And he has just come out recently and said, if you're a young person, the best thing you can do is go and work in a clean energy industry. Like go and get your degree in nuclear engineering, And I thought that was such a great thing to come out and say, because again, that is real leadership. People aren't saying these things, but we need people to build this future. We need to imagine the future, like I said earlier, but also we need to, what you said, lay the foundation and build this future. And we cannot do it without all hands on deck. And we actually have a shortage in a lot of these areas too. Typically in STEM student subjects we do. So we should encourage people to go out and get careers in these areas where there will be plentiful jobs, because we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, but also because it means that they're all contributing in really important ways. And we will not do this on our own. It has to be all hands on deck.
Just got a final question from the chat that I want to ask you, if you can deal with it briefly, because there's one other one I want to ask you to finish off on, how the time flies. Martin in the chat says, how quickly do you think that the gas network needs to be closed down? And does it need to be nationalised? He's talking about the UK here, clearly, to make that happen without a cliff edge. What do you think about that?
So in terms of how quickly, I mean, this is complicated, and why I would always say to people that it's only as quick as you can only do it as quickly as you're managing the transition. So there's no kind of, we could do it in a year or we could do it in 4 years. And there's a danger of politicians making those promises because it sounds great, and people want solid answers, but let's not leap ahead too far here. People will die if we just shut off fossil fuels. Look at what happened in the energy crisis. We have to have the alternatives in place. So we're doing that. We're switching our diesel cars to electric vehicles. We're switching from gas boilers to heat pumps. But that's happening fairly slowly, and in the meantime, we need the gas to cook. We need the gas for our daily lifestyles, right? We are completely fueled by oil and gas. Let's be honest about that. We can decarbonize the grid, but we also have to kind of decarbonize ourselves. That will happen as quickly as it is able to happen. And then naturally we wean off the gas. I don't think it's a case of shut the tap, it's too late, which is, let's be honest, that is what a lot of environmentalists say. Just stop oil, do it right now. No, people would die if you did that right now. Our lifestyles are heavily dependent on these things. So what I would push for instead is, the question is, how quickly can we get those alternatives in? Well, why not roll out the heat pumps, subsidize them, make them cheap? They're very expensive at the moment. Make them cheap. Can we make them cheaper? Can we build them here? Lots of things that we could be thinking about there. How do we really wean off gas? How quickly can it happen? As for nationalization, fully support that, yes. And I think, not just in that area, but there are lots of benefits to be had from nationalisation. I don't see it happening currently under this government, though.
Yeah, we haven't got time to discuss that, unfortunately, but I suspect we may well sort of come to a confluence of opinion on that anyway. But final question, Zion. We talked about a lot there. It's clear that you are, it seems to me, an optimist. Why should we be optimistic despite the challenges around this issue, despite everything that we face about the future? Why do you think we ought to be looking to the future with confidence?
For most of human history, we lived in poverty. We burned a lot of fossil fuels. We went from fire, the first technology, arguably, through coal and oil and gas to where we are now. Now we have a new transition to make to clean technologies, including nuclear and some wind and solar. We have lifted more people out of extreme poverty than ever before. More people have access to clean drinking water and sanitization now than ever before. Don't believe all the doom and gloom, because it's not. These things have not happened by accidents. They have happened because people have good values and they want improvement and they have worked together. And that is always how progress happens. And the next transition is to switch to clean energy. It is to get the foundation laid for, fighting climate change, but also tackling air pollution. Again, that is happening. There is a positive trajectory, and I urge anyone to go away and look at the IEE report. If you don't believe me, I've written about it on my Substack, and I'll put a link in the chat. Yeah, we are phenomenally good at solving the world's problems when we work together. We can put people in space. We can put people who live in space on the International Space Station. We can solve this. We just need to be tactful. We need to go evidence-based, look at what's worked around the world. We know what works, and we just need to make sure we do it.
Sion, thanks very much for talking to us this morning, and for finishing on an optimistic note. I've seen you put the link in the chat there. That article that you wrote about why aren't people celebrating about this latest news about 1.5 is well worth a read, as is the whole of your Substack, actually. And I'll be going away to read it in the half an hour that I've got before our next climate leadership interview. But really, thank you very much indeed
Thank you
for joining us this morning. Coming up next, starting at 10 a.m., we've got our second climate leadership interview with Adrian Del Maestro, who is the Global Energy Advisory Lead at AECOM. If you want to join that session, you can just stay online using the link that you use to access this particular interview, and we'll be back after a short break. And we'll see you at 10 a.m. Thanks again, Zion, and see you at 10 a.m., everybody.